This is Politics UK. I'm Vicki Young. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights. I'll be joined by correspondents in Edinburgh and Cardiff, and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent Susan Hume. On the programme this week, the Prime Minister and Leader of the Opposition clash over the government's Rwanda legislation.
Only this government could waste hundreds of millions of pounds on a removals policy that doesn't remove anyone.
We want to stop the boats. We have a plan. It's working. And with him, we would just go back to square one.
The ayes to the right, 320. The noes to the left, 276. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Look!
But the government manages to get its legislation through the House of Commons. Fujitsu, the company behind the faulty post office computer system, apologises for an appalling miscarriage of justice.
We did have bugs and errors in the system, and we did help the post office in their prosecutions of the sub-postmasters. For that, we are truly sorry.
But one campaigner says nothing will erase the past.
It'll never let my mum and dad see me have my conviction course, so to me that's what it all looks like. But, you know, apart from that, we need to see deeds, not words.
And in Wales, clashes over the 20-mile-an-hour speed limit introduced last year.
As far as I'm concerned, we don't need a review. We need this policy scrapped.
Cars are driving slower. People are complying with the spirit of the new law.
But let's start here in Westminster with Susan Hume, where, I think we've said this before, it's been a very big week for the government with its Safety of Rwanda Bill, also known as the Rwanda Asylum Plan. So what's been going on?
Well, quick reminder first, this is the government's long-running plan now to send asylum seekers to Rwanda to be resettled. The idea behind that is that people will be put off coming to the UK at all, for example, in small boats across the Channel if they think they might be sent to Rwanda. However, it's run into problems already with the Supreme Court ruling that, well, you can't say that Rwanda is safe, so the UK could be breaking its international obligations to refugees. The government's solution to this legal problem is to come up with a new law that says Rwanda is safe. Now, a lot of opposition parties don't like that. A lot of Conservatives, though, say there are still too many loopholes and get-outs that will allow people to appeal, so they want to actually strengthen the bill. They came up with a raft of ways of doing that. They didn't actually succeed, but there was a big rebellion. Around 60 of them voted against the government to try, as they see it, to make that bill stronger. Of course, as I was saying, it's not just them who don't like the bill. Opposition parties are also very much opposed to it. And they say, goodness sake, how can you have a bill that just says with the stroke of a pen, Rwanda is safe? So all debated this week.
This government grants asylum to people from Rwanda because that country is not safe. I don't believe that anyone who supports this awful bill can do so knowing the people it will affect. To lay out in such cruel terms that they would remove the rights of our fellow human beings because all they did was seek sanctuary and safety.
What matters is, does this scheme work? And why does that matter? It matters because illegal migration is doing untold damage to our country. It is costing us billions of pounds. It's exploiting tens of thousands of people. The current bill doesn't work. And the test of whether it works is not can we get a few symbolic flights off in the months ahead with a small number of illegal migrants on them. The test is can we create the kind of sustainable deterrent that we set out to achieve.
Clause 4 of this disgusting bill already provides a very, very limited route for individuals to challenge their removal to Rwanda based on their individual circumstances. Yet my understanding is that the Right Honourable Member is seeking to go even further to override individual legal protections. Even decisions which contain errors would not be open to challenge.
We find ourselves debating a government policy which has been found to be unlawful by the highest court in our land. And we find ourselves confronted by a government that is seeking to legislate for an alternative reality. Because whilst ministers appear to believe that they can pass a bill which determines that the sky is green and the grass is blue, that does not make it so.
I strongly urge the government to note the sheer anger and frustration demonstrated in opinion polls and public concern that we get this bill right and make it work. If not, this anger will continue up to and including the general election.
There is actually a landing space where we can deliver something that will make a difference, that will act as a deterrent, without getting rid of all the individual rights that we have in our domestic and international law, and that is what we should be aiming to achieve.
This legislation is clear, it is unambiguous, and as drafted, Parliament is setting out the law clearly, and it will work.
I want to thank all colleagues who are trying to strengthen this bill. I want it to be as robust as it possibly can be, because we need it to be fit for the crisis that we face.
The new legally binding treaty with the government of the Republic of Rwanda does, in fact, respond to the concerns set out by the Supreme Court. It also reflects the strength of the government of Rwanda's protections and commitments, both to this scheme and to the rule of law. But, Mr. Evans, let there be no doubt that the government is focused and determined to stop the boats. We have made progress, but we must be enabled to finish the job.
So lots of attempts to try and amend or change that bill, but actually none of them were successful in the end.
No, that's right, because those 60 Conservative rebels want to make it stronger, but the government and government loyalists are happy with it as it is. And opposition MPs think it already goes too far, so they certainly weren't going to vote for any strengthening.
Now, it, of course, was a big rebellion for Rishi Sunak. I mean, 60 MPs, I think it's the biggest rebellion he's had. And, of course, when it came to Prime Minister's questions, that gave Sir Keir Starmer quite a lot of ammunition to attack the Prime Minister with.
Yeah, I mean, don't forget, the whole idea of sending asylum seekers to Rwanda is something that arose out of the final weeks of Boris Johnson in Downing Street, when he was under a lot of pressure over Partygate, and he needed something to help shift the political dial. And it's been reported that Rishi Sunak was never all that keen on the idea in the first place. So for the second week running, Keir Starmer has needled him about that, about the political headaches it's caused him for really a Boris Johnson policy to start with, and indeed about his success with immigration in general.
Mr. Speaker, the government has been forced to admit that it has lost contact with 85% of the 5,000 people earmarked for removal to Rwanda. Has he found them yet?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, what I can tell the honourable gentleman is that in spite of him blocking every single attempt that we have taken, we have managed now, because of our actions, to reduce the number of people coming here by over a third last year, remove over 20,000 people from this country back to their home countries, carried out 70% more illegal enforcement raids, arrested hundreds of people, closed down thousands of bank accounts, and processed over 100,000 cases, the biggest number in over 20 years, Mr. Speaker. That's because on this side of the House, we want to stop the boats, we have a plan, it's working, and with him, we would just go back to square one.
My first thought is, how do you actually lose 4,250 people? Then you remember that this is the government that scrapped HS2, but the costs are still rising by billions. This is the government that spent £400 million of taxpayers' money on a Rwanda scheme, yet can't deport a single person. And this is the government that waged a week-long war on the Greek Prime Minister for reasons known only to themselves, and suddenly are reminded that, of course, this farce of a government could lose the people it was planning to remove. But he didn't answer the question, so I'll ask him again. Where are the 4,250 people that the government has lost? Where are they?
Mr. Speaker, as I said, we've actually identified and removed over 20,000 people from this country back to where they belong. But he asks these questions about the Rwanda scheme, Mr. Speaker. Now, it is important that we get this up and running, because it's important, as the National Crime Agency say, that we have a working deterrence to resolve this issue. That's indeed how Australia solved this problem, and that's how Albania has worked for us. But we know he asked these questions, Mr. Speaker, about the detail of these things, but we all know he doesn't actually care about solving this problem.
Mr. Speaker, spending £400 million on a plan not to get anybody to Rwanda whilst losing 4,000 people is not a plan. It's a farce. Only this government could waste hundreds of millions of pounds on a removals policy that doesn't remove anyone. Only this government could claim that it's going to get flights off the ground only to discover they couldn't find a plane. Only this government could sign a removal deal with Rwanda, only to end up taking people from Rwanda to here. But he still hasn't answered the question. So I'll try again. What progress has he made in locating the 4,250 people his government has apparently lost? He's dodged it 3 times. Where are they?
Mr. Speaker, it's the same thing again and again. Here we are talking about what we are doing, but I'm happy to go over it, Mr. Speaker. What are we doing? We've increased the number of illegal enforcement raids by 70%, leading to thousands of arrests, using powers, Mr. Speaker, that he blocked in this House. We have closed down thousands of bank accounts of illegal workers, again, using powers that he blocked. We have worked through a record number of cases and returned a record number of people back to where they've come. All of that is a plan that is working, and we can see that it's working because the numbers of people coming to this country are down by over a third, Mr. Speaker. But again, it is a bit rich to hear him in here pretending that he cares about how we actually stop the boats when he's been crystal clear. He's been crystal clear and said that even if the plan is working to reduce the numbers, he would still scrap it, Mr. Speaker. It's because he has no values, no conviction and no plan. It is back to square one.
Of course, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to the Rwanda Bill, the reality is that if you want to stop the smuggling gangs, you should introduce safe and legal routes. But instead, the Prime Minister is seeking to weaponise some of the most vulnerable people in society. It is straight out of the cruel and callous right-wing extremist playgroup. His time in office is fast approaching its conclusion. Does he seriously want this to be his legacy?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, as I said, it is important that we stop the boats because illegal migration is simply not fair, Mr. Speaker. It's not right that some people jump the queue, that they take away our resources to help those who are the most compassionate, that need our most help, and, by the way, Mr. Speaker, are exploited by gangs, and many of them lose their lives making these dangerous crossings. So I completely disagree with the honourable gentleman. The fair and the compassionate thing to do is to break these criminal gangs, and that's why we're going to stop the boats.
So, Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak clashing there, and it wasn't quite the end of the argument, was it?
Oh, it really wasn't, because, as you were saying earlier, those Conservative rebels failed in all their attempts to make the bill tougher. So the question for them at the end was, were they going to vote with the government to let what they see as a weak bill go on to its next stage, or were they going to decide to scupper it? Could they actually bring themselves to walk through the lobbies with the opposition parties who also want to scupper it because they think it's actually too strong? Were they going to be prepared to do that? Well, most of them thought not. 11 of them did rebel on that and voted with the opposition parties, but most of them thought that is going too far. It could have not only scuppered the bill, but it could have scuppered Rishi Sunak as well. It would have been a terrible blow to his authority. So in the end, the government did win that vote.
Order.
The ayes to the right, 320. The noes to the left, 276.
The ayes to the right, 320. The noes to the left, 276. The ayes have it, the ayes have it. Look!
So the government won that bit of it. What happens next?
It's still not over. Off to the House of Lords, where, of course, the government doesn't have a majority there, so they can get defeated. There can be changes to the bill. There are plenty of people in there who aren't very happy with it. So we will be back in weeks to come talking about the Safety of Rwanda Bill.
Thank you, Susan. More from you later. To Edinburgh now, and our Scotland political correspondent, Jenny Davidson, who's at the Scottish Parliament in Holyrood. Jenny, there's obviously been a lot of attention on the Post Office Horizon scandal, and there have been questions on when Scotland's prosecution service found out. And this week, the Lord Advocate made a statement at Holyrood. What did she have to say?
Well, the Lord Advocate is the head of Scotland's Prosecution Service, the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service. And unlike in England, where the Post Office itself brought prosecutions, in Scotland it was the independent Crown Office that prosecuted on the basis of Post Office evidence. So questions have been asked about how the Crown Office reacted once concerns started to be raised about the Horizon IT system. But the Lord Advocate, Dorothy Bain, put the blame firmly back on the Post Office itself, saying the Crown Office had repeatedly received assurances about the Horizon system and they were entitled to take those assurances at face value. But she did apologise to those who'd been wrongly convicted.
I am very deeply troubled by what has occurred, and I remain acutely concerned that the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service was repeatedly misled by the Post Office. Assurances which were just not true were repeatedly given. To those wrongfully convicted, I understand your anger and I apologise for the way that you've been failed by trusted institutions and the criminal justice system.
Ministers in the Crown Office knew of issues with the evidence from the Post Office over a decade ago in 2013, but we need to know why new prosecutions only formally halted 2 years later and why no immediate action was taken to review all previous convictions as to whether they were unsafe.
Between 2000 and 2013, there was no record of prosecutors having been made aware of the deficiencies in the Horizon system. In May 2013, the Post Office lawyers contacted the Crown to address public concerns, and in that meeting, and indeed thereafter, right up until 2015, in October 2015, the Post Office officials advised the Crown Office officials that they remain confident in Horizon. So it's just simply wrong to assert that the Crown Office officials knew that there was problems with the Horizon system.
Now, it's interesting to note a difference between the Lord Advocate and the First Minister's views, it seems, on how they think this should be approached now, with the Lord Advocate seeming to favour a process where each case goes through an appeals process in the court, but the First Minister having indicated that he prefers a mass exoneration.
Yeah, and that difference between the two there and their views on how the wrongful Post Office convictions should be dealt with. It came up at First Minister's questions as well, didn't it?
Yeah, that's right, it did, Vicky, with Scottish Conservative leader Douglas Ross quoting back parts of the Lord Advocate's statement and asking which of the two processes processes was going to be followed, and he warned that what was being suggested by the Lord Advocate could take a lot longer, and that even some more postmasters could die before they had their names cleared if that was the process that was followed. Now, Humza Yousaf has said again at First Minister's questions that he favours a legislative consent motion, which would mean the Scottish Parliament gives the UK government permission to legislate in a devolved area to cover Scotland in its exoneration, and he plans to work with the UK government on that.
The UK legislation, it will apply in England and Wales, but this issue is devolved here in Scotland, and we have his top legal officer who sits in the Scottish Government Cabinet saying something quite different to the First Minister. Let me quote again from the Lord Advocate on Tuesday. It's an important process because not every case involving horizon evidence will be a miscarriage of justice, and each case must be considered carefully. That's the Lord Advocate's current position. So what that is a refusal to change the process and accelerate the system because there may be some guilty people. Surely it's better to accept the tiny possibility that a guilty person will have their conviction overturned than allowing dozens of innocent postmasters to live with the stain of guilt for a minute longer.
I think that the choice that Douglas Ross is presenting as a binary choice is not the correct one. The best position for all of us is urgently seeing the mass exoneration for those who were wrongfully convicted. And of course, for those whose conviction was sound and is sound, nobody wants to see necessarily their conviction overturned and then being able to apply for compensation. So if we can get the best of both worlds, if we can get to that position, that is the best position to get to. And that is why we're willing to work with the UK government, who presumably also don't want sound convictions overturned if they can avoid that. We will work with the UK government in that respect.
Now, it's not clear yet whether the UK government can or will include Scotland in its legislation. The Prime Minister said he welcomes discussions between the Scottish and UK Justice Ministers, but those discussions are still ongoing. However, the First Minister has made clear that he will decide what legislation is brought forward in Scotland, and that the Scottish Government is planning a contingency in case that UK-wide approach doesn't work out.
Now, there have also been questions this week about a reduction in university places, haven't there? What's that about?
Well, this began with a Times story looking at some figures in the Scottish budget that suggested a cut to higher education teaching funding that would lead to a loss of places. Now, the Finance Secretary, Shona Robison, was asked about this in a committee on Tuesday. She explained that this was 1,200 extra places that had been created with COVID funding during the pandemic due to a spike in the number of pupils qualifying to go to university, while grades were being based on teacher assessments rather than exams. She said this wasn't sustainable and was now being reversed. But the Education Secretary, Jenny Eagle-Ruth, was asked about it again the following day in the Education Committee.
Cabinet Secretary, it's your portfolio, so you must have calculated this. How many young Scots will not have a place at Scottish universities going forward?
These are the additional places we built into the system during the pandemic to protect students and support them through their learning. And remember, during the pandemic, we had higher numbers of young people going on to higher education as a result, largely, and I heard Alistair Sim say this on the radio this morning, of changes to the qualifications and the examinations during the pandemic. So we expected higher numbers to flow into our university system, and that's why we built in these additional numbers. What we have done throughout the period since the pandemic is progressively withdraw those places, and this removal is, I think, the final removal of these additional places that were built in prior to my time in office.
And this has brought back into focus the issue of free university tuition in Scotland, because those going to university doing a first undergraduate degree in Scotland don't pay any fees. That's covered by the Scottish Government. But it does mean there's more of a limit on the number of places for Scottish students at Scottish universities, and that has highlighted this issue again.
Jenny Davidson at Holyrood there, thank you very much. Let's return now to Westminster and Susan. We were hearing there from Jenny about the sub-postmasters and there was much more, wasn't there, on the Horizon IT scandal here at Westminster too?
Yes, and of course the postmasters and mistresses who were wrongly accused of stealing money from the post office have been fighting for years and years to clear their names and get compensation. Things have been happening. There's a public inquiry and there are compensation schemes, but really the whole thing has sparked our attention again from that ITV drama, and some of the real life versions of those characters were back in Parliament to talk to MPs about their experience, but also about how they're being treated now.
When you take on a sub-post office, you actually invest a large amount of money in that business. And as happened in my case, when they fell out with me, they walked off with that amount of money. And I think a lot of people feel there's a financial gun held to their head if they start kicking off or start raising too many problems with post office.
Are you now slightly furious that after a high-profile drama, after everything that you've been through, there are still so few people who have actually seen full redress for the scandal that was done to them? How are you feeling?
I'm frustrated, to put it mildly. I mean, there is no reason at all why full financial redress shouldn't have been delivered by now. It's gone on for far too long. People are suffering, they're dying, we're losing numbers along the way. And it just seems to be tied up in bureaucracy. And that seems to be the big problem.
Are you saying that the people who are processing the claim are not busting a gut to actually get the job done?
Oh gosh, yes. I mean, after my claim had gone in, and mine's just in the queue like everyone else's, not being dealt with specially at all. But I mean, after mine had gone in, it took them, I think it was 53 days before they asked 3 very simple questions.
It sounds like after all the hell that you've been through, you're still going through hell to finally get justice done.
It's almost like you're being retried, because everything you say you'd like, they say, oh, we'll justify that and justify that. And it just goes on and on and on. They convinced me that it was all my fault. And I wasn't tech savvy at all back 20 years ago. And yeah, they convinced me it was my fault. And that it was before the days of social media. So you felt like I really was alone. And I thought I must have pressed something and reversed something that they kept my wages. And then I remortgaged and put money in. And because I had such a long lease on the shop, I knew if they because they said they'll sack me. And then I thought, well, the whole thing will collapse. And I felt I had no choice but to run with it and keep putting money in.
Do you actually truly believe justice will ever be achieved? If I start with you, Miss Hamilton, first.
Well, it'll never let my mum and dad see me have my conviction course, so to me that's what it all looks like. But, apart from that, we need to see deeds, not words. You can say things, but I just think for everybody now to draw a line under this, the very minimum is the GLO group who are still left looking for money. It needs to be fast-tracked. There has to be a way of applying a bit of common sense to this and cutting out all the red tape.
Mr. Bates, sorry.
Yeah, Joey's right. I was talking to one of the group at the weekend. She's 91 years old. How many more years has she got to wait for financial redress? I mean, has she got to wait till she gets a telegram from the King?
You can hear their frustration there, despite the smiles, can't you? Now, also facing the committee were the chief executives of the Post Office and of Fujitsu Europe. Everyone intrigued to know what they wanted to say.
Yeah, of course, neither of those guys was in post at the height of all of this. So the MPs were a little bit frustrated because there were lots of I don't knows coming from them. I suppose some of that will come out in the public inquiry. However, from the Fujitsu boss, they did get a sorry and they did get an offer as well.
Fujitsu would like to apologise for our part in this appalling miscarriage of justice. We were involved from the very start. We did have bugs and errors in the system, and we did help the Post Office in their prosecutions of the sub-postmasters. For that, we are truly sorry. It is very clear from the evidence before the committee and also in the inquiry that our standards were not at the level that we adhere to and state, as you've rightly read. I am personally appalled.
Did staff in your organisation before 2010 know that there were problems with the Horizon system?
So I believe that Sir Win...
Simple yes or no?
Well, I don't personally know, Chair. I think the inquiry is looking at that very point that you...
What's your gut feel?
My gut feel would be yes.
Can you tell us how much you now think your company should contribute to the compensation bill?
The inquiry is dealing with some very complex matters over...
But is there a moral obligation, Mr Patterson, for you to contribute?
I think there is a moral obligation for the company to contribute, and I think the right place to determine that is when our responsibility is very clear. There are many parties involved in this travesty.
I just want to check, Mr Reid, from your point of view, when do you think Post Office staff first knew that remote access to Horizon terminals was possible?
I couldn't give you an exact date on that.
Why can you not answer that question? It is fundamental to this case.
What is fundamental from our perspective is we are facilitating Sir Win getting to the bottom of all of these issues.
How long have you been the chief executive now?
Because coming into the organisation...
How long have you been the chief executive now?
4 years.
You must surely have had time in 4 years to cut to the heart of this issue, which is when did the Post Office know remote access to terminals was possible?
My role, certainly coming into the Post Office, is to do a number of things. Of course it is to speed up as much as we can and as quickly as we can the compensation that's being paid.
Mr Reid, when you took over in 2019, the Post Office was already engaged in substantial civil litigation. Yes, brought by the Post Office. So you, as Chief Executive, would have wanted to bring yourself fully up to speed with the background of that, I'm sure. Having done that, can you help us as to why it was nobody in the Post Office, as I've seen, ever queried why there'd been such a sudden uptick in the number of prosecutions of your postmasters? The question never seems to have been asked. Can you help as to why?
What astonishes me when I look back to 2019 through to 2015 is that there are between 55 and 75 prosecutions approximately every single year. It is an extraordinary number. Yeah. Don't get me wrong, it is an absolutely extraordinary number that kind of, or that lack of curiosity for individuals saying, why is this the case? What is going on is something that remains a mystery.
The Horizon Compensation Advisory Board is saying that you are responsible for the delay because much of the evidence has been lost or destroyed by the Post Office. So you led the prosecutions, and now trying to even overturn these convictions is being hampered by the fact that your organisation, has lost the information that could give people the justice that they seek.
It's an extremely complex beast, and I don't think anybody would be surprised, having listened to the evidence just from today, that over the last 25 years, it is going to be extremely complicated to get hold of all of this data and all of this documentation.
Now, there is, of course, an ongoing public inquiry. We heard them referencing that there has been going on since 2021 into how and why this happened, and it's being chaired by the retired judge, Sir Win Williams. Now, interestingly, since that committee appearance, Fujitsu has said that they won't bid for any new government contracts until the inquiry report. So this is definitely going to go on. Thank you very much, Susan. Back to you in a little bit. Let's go over to Cardiff now and our Wales political correspondent, Rhodri Lewis, who's at the Welsh Parliament, the Senedd, where pressures on the Welsh NHS came up again at First Minister's questions. Rhodri, what specifically was the issue with the NHS?
Well, the ongoing pressures on the NHS across the UK has led in turn to government ministers coming under pressure about what they're doing about it. And this week in Wales, we've had a 3-day strike by junior doctors over pay. But here in the Senedd, the Leader of the Opposition asked about the annual report by the body which inspects Welsh health services, which he said didn't paint a pretty picture.
First Minister, Health Inspectorate Wales' annual report came out at the back end of last year, and later on this afternoon we're going to have a statement from the Health Secretary outlining winter pressures within the NHS. In their report, they touched on that there had been various initiatives in place to help support services cope with unrelenting demand but their work on the inspectorate side of things could find no evidence that these initiatives were making clear and significant differences to the service on the front line. Why is the Welsh Government missing its target on helping hospitals and other healthcare settings deal with winter pressures and the unrelenting demand as identified by the Health Inspectorate?
Well, so as I've read the Inspector's report, it's a good deal more balanced, as you would expect, than the question from the Leader of the Opposition. It does point to unrelenting pressures on the service. It does point to increasing demand, but it also quite certainly points to those new initiatives and services that are making a real difference in the NHS. And if those services were not there, the 111 Press 2 service, the urgent primary care centres, the same-day emergency care provision in our hospitals, the report is clear that the service would not be dealing with the pressures in the way that it is.
Now, the First Minister went on to say that some elements of the NHS's work here in Wales, such as ambulance waiting times outside hospitals and the performance of A&D departments, were better than last year, though he did acknowledge that the pressures remain intense.
And what's happened with business rate relief in Wales? That's come up too, hasn't it?
Yes, it has. Well, the Welsh Government is reducing the relief for retail and hospitality from 75% to 40%, despite it remaining at 75% in England. Now, the leader of Plaid Cymru, Rhun Iorwerth, asked why that was happening when the Welsh Government was aiming to attract more businesses and shoppers to high streets in town centres.
I met with Welsh hospitality leaders today who shared with me their frustrations and fears about the future of their sector. Just in the past week, renowned and well-established food and drink businesses in the First Minister's own constituency have announced their intention to close, and the decision to cut business rate relief has been described as the final nail in the coffin for many independent businesses by the Welsh Independent Restaurant Collective. Now, the current business rate relief of 75% was never intended to continue indefinitely, say ministers, but putting a safety net in place 1 minute and then pulling it away when times are particularly tough isn't a coherent approach. Now, does the First Minister share my concern that businesses in hospitality are closing because of this, and will he listen to the industry's voices and reconsider that decision?
Well, Llywydd, we will not be reconsidering that decision unless Plaid Cymru can tell me where the money that has been diverted from business rate relief to support many other programmes, including many of the other programmes that week after week Plaid Cymru members will tell me we have to find more money for. If he will tell me where that money is to come from, then I'll consider whether I think that he's made a sufficiently compelling case.
Now, Mark Drakeford also said that this was only ever meant to have been a temporary scheme which was funded by the Westminster Government. He said the Welsh Government was trying to find a pathway out of subsidy for the sector and that the right decision had been made.
And we return to a familiar topic, the 20-mile-an-hour speed limit, Roger.
Yes, indeed. Even though this was brought in last September, it's still very, very controversial in some areas of Wales and means the default speed on most Welsh roads, where it had been 30 miles an hour, has been reduced to 20 unless local councils have implemented any exemptions. Now, ministers have announced a review of the policy, but the Tories want it gone.
As far as I'm concerned, we don't need a review. We need this policy scrapped, as we can already see the huge damage it's inflicting on Wales with a £9 billion blow to the economy, hampering people's livelihoods, damaging public transport networks and slowing down our emergency services. Regardless of what you're going to argue with me, Deputy Minister, it's the truth.
So again, we're having smoke and mirror tactics from the Conservative benches. They have no constructive suggestions of their own about how to tackle road safety. They have no constructive suggestions of their own of how to achieve modal shift. They have no suggestions of their own how to reduce noise pollution in community. And despite all their claims that this is a deeply unpopular policy, cars are driving slower. People are complying with the spirit of the new law. This is popular in many streets, and in fact, some streets that have been exempted and kept at 30, there are people living on those streets who are making the case to their local authority to reduce them to 20. So this is going to be a period of flex and flux.
Flex and flux, says the Deputy Minister there, but he also said he hoped the policy would settle down and that the review would iron out any inconsistencies.
Rodri Lewis at the Senate there. Thank you very much indeed. Now back to Westminster and to the House of Lords. Susan, this week, peers discussed changes to driving licences for young motorists. What were they talking about?
Yeah, still on road safety, and they were talking about the sad fact that young drivers are much more likely to have road accidents, and indeed fatal ones at that. The insurance industry is among those who are calling for something called a graduated driving licence scheme. Now, that would mean that you couldn't, as is the case today, pass your test and then you're just off on the road, no questions further asked, same as everyone else. Instead, there would be, well, first of all, a minimum learning period of a year, so none of these fast-track driving schemes, intensive driving schemes. And then new drivers under 25 would be restricted for a time on how many passengers they could carry and at what time of day they could drive, so not late at night, for example. The government is not keen, but quite a lot of peers thought it was a very good idea.
In Wales, in the few weeks before Christmas, 7 young men, still teenagers, lost their lives in tragic car accidents. Year after year, young drivers, particularly young men, are grossly overrepresented in road casualty rates.
My Lords, I remind the House that I have an interest, as I am a qualified HGV driving instructor, and I've done a lot of work with young drivers. Why does the Minister not, my noble friend the Minister, not understand that young novice drivers are completely ill-equipped and unable to block out the distractions from youngsters in the back of the vehicle unless they have an adult with them?
Not all drivers are that bad, and we just have to aim at aim at looking at making sure that the young novice driver, who is perhaps not as shall we say, experienced as others, is properly dealt with.
Surely with the considerable increase in the volume of traffic, particularly on motorways, and the introduction of smart motorways, it is a bit ludicrous that a novice driver can pass their driving test and drive straight from that driving test onto a motorway, which they may never have driven on before, and in the dark, which equally they may never have driven in before.
I think noble lords should be aware that on acquiring their first full licence, a new driver is on probation for 2 years. During this time, they are subject to a limit of 6 penalty points for any driving offences, including any received when in the learning stage. And if 6 or more points are received, then a driver loses their full licence and must apply again for a provisional licence, re-entering the learning stage.
Could my noble friend explain why it is that when you are 70, you have to reapply for your driving licence? Why pick on 70?
Can I say that I agree with the noble lord? At the age of 70, of course, drivers must renew their entitlement, and at most every 3 years after that. And to renew the entitlement, they must make a legal declaration that they can meet the standards required to drive and confirm whether they have listed any medical condition. And I think that's the important point.
Reviewing the issue of young drivers, perhaps if he's going to do that, he'll look at older drivers. As far as I know, there's not been any young drivers driving up motorways in the wrong direction.
Many of members of this House are grandparents with teenage grandchildren. Can I just say as one, it is exceedingly alarming to know that a new driver who has just passed their test can take a number of youngsters out after a party, after some other gathering or to a gathering, that surely and hopefully they're not breaking the law by drinking, but the behaviour in the car and the distraction is genuinely a serious issue and is a major cause of so many of the accidents about which we're concerned.
That is why the government has commissioned this young driver research piece, the Driver 2020 project, and hopefully can come out with some sort of suggestions as to how we may deal with this.
Well, lots of ideas there about driving, but the government didn't seem too keen. Thank you very much, Susan. Now, Politics Live will be back on Monday at 12:15 on BBC Two and iPlayer. But that's all for Politics UK for this week.